It's time to.
So it's time for us to talk about stuff and things, and maybe also answer great important questions of our lives when we consider and think about the advice that we've both received, and more importantly, the advice that we've given. Um, we might have to deal with that. But how are you doing today, man? Are you
Oh
good?
man, I'm pretty good. We're in that my favorite time of the year where it's like 39 degrees when I wake up and it's 70 during the day. This is
Yeah, it's not
perfect
bad.
weather for Terry. This is my season.
It's prime Terry season right now. Prime
This
Terry
is
season.
this is my season. Got my sweaters out of the attic. We're good to go. It's my season.
Cool. Um, so normally we keep doing this little off-topic discussion, of things that are of value or importance. Because our
So
current
this is
topic,
this is not valuable, is what you're saying. This
no,
is
no,
the
this is
this is
supremely valuable.
this is the
Um,
zero value segment of the
now
of the
this is
show.
for all the parents. Terry, what was your favorite book to read to your kids?
I didn't read to my kids. I don't read to anybody. What are you talking about?
Don't lie to me. I know you did.
Okay. Llama Llama Red Pajama was a big hit, but
Nice.
there's one book that I read to my kids, and I've read to my wife's classes until I think we moved here because she was younger ages. It's called Piggy Pie, and
Huh.
it's based off of Old McDonald's farm, and I do voices. I mean, it's a hit. It's a big hit for Mr. Terry to come read Piggy Pie to a classroom. So, um, just saying that's the story I've read the most. I have a witch voice, and I have a pig voice, and it's a hit. It's a good way to go. What about you?
Cool. I think, like for me, it was definitely Goodnight Moon.
We
That
read
was
Goodnight
one that
Moon. Yep.
that was
We
the
also read a book called Snuffle Bunny. Did you have Snuffle Bunny? Did you ever have that book?
no Snuffle Bunny, no Snuffle Bunny.
Yeah. Snuffle Bunny was good. There was this word we used from there that Snuffle Bunny would be like active and alive until adults were around. Then he would go boneless. And that's like when your kid just melts. It doesn't do anything you want them to do. They go boneless. So, yeah.
Well,
Goodnight Moon's good.
Goodnight Moon, yeah, it's still part of the vocabulary of our lives in some ways. It pops its self up in various places. Um,
I mean, there's a bunch of hits at our house, believe it or not. Like green eggs and ham's a good way to go. Remember the Sesame Street when you get what is it? Give the monster a cookie or something. The
oh
monster book.
yeah,
That's a monster book.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a
yeah.
big
Monster
one.
Book. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
the monster
monster is
book's
you.
fantastic. Yeah, the monster's you. That's a fantastic book. And
Yeah.
then Snuffle Bunny was big. Skippy John Jones. I'm a reader to my bones. That's a good series. Yeah, man. We got
Yeah. So that wasn't a hard question at all. Were you a little nervous, a little anxious to see what the?
man. I don't get nervous with your bonus time questions anymore. They're
You
innocent.
used to. You used to be really, really anxious. A little concerned. A little
You give
concerned.
yourself too much credit.
I got notes. I got notes.
You give yourself too much credit.
All right. So the topic for today, hopefully, will be a little bit of enjoyable, but also insightful. And what about bad advice? One of the questions that Terry and I posed around early this morning is, what's some of the worst advice you've been given as a preacher? And a full disclosure, I will not be by any means identifying the source of some of this advice unless the advice came from me. I'll take full accountability for my bad advice, but I won't be throwing anyone under the bus.
Oh, I'll throw people under the bus. It's fine.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
Mainly because I probably don't remember where the advice came from. And so it's the advantage of the grayness underneath the chin, my gray chin strap here. I think it's causing my memory to fade just a little bit in my semi-old age. So Joe, let's start it off with. And by the way, if you're participating in public, you want to comment and offer something, please go ahead and do so. If you feel like that's not the place where you want to post that and you need a little anonymity for that advice, send it to Terry and I. Um, you know, and will certainly reword the advice or restate it as needed to protect the guilty and the innocent from additional shame or praise. Um, and so Hal wants to be tagged as interested bystander. I think he's probably a little nervous and anxious about the bad advice part. Uh, uh, but I'll talk about this thing in particular. I mentioned it to a friend this morning as well. Um, Early on, working with a congregation, this was I came to work with a group when I was single. Jill and I got married, and two sets of advice were given to me in regards to how our finances would change as we got married. The real David Bonner, not David Mel Bonner, for those who live in Texas. David Mel is the dentist. His dad, David Bonner, preacher in Texas. He looked at me and he said, "You know what? Two people can live on the wage of one for about half as long." And so he was just gently telling me in his own David Bonner way that you're probably going to need more money. Uh, you know, um, the other end of the table was in conversations with the local church. I had already had a congregation that was willing to support me for an additional amount of extra wages because I knew the balance sheet for the congregation that I was with. And I went to the men about that, and they asked that I take my entire budget, write it out on the wall for them, so that they could help me see if this was really a necessary thing. And once I did that, the amount of additional income that I thought we needed was exactly equal to the amount that I was contributing to my retirement plan, 403B. And a number of the men said, "Well, there's your solution right there. You just need to stop planning for your retirement, and you're good." And my eyes were like this. It was that point I knew that we were living in two different worlds.
I was told by a preacher one time. This is actually goes in the category of good advice to that. When you're asked to do a budget, he said instead of doing your budget, go around the room and pick the guy that has the nicest house and go, "Okay, John, what's your house payment? Okay, Bill, how much are you paying for your cars that are brand new?" And like use their budget collectively to go, let's talk about yeah. I those yeah. I actually on the finances side, this was a business meeting church. I had asked
This
for
was
more
as well.
money. I was making barely at the poverty line and the idea of a raise came up, which was not even like a 3% raise technically. Um, and the advice was given that my marriage would grow better if I was kept poor, that I would learn how to love my wife more if we were living in poverty. That was actually said, which was terrible advice, by the way.
Did they
Terrible advice.
practice that advice?
I think early on they did, and I mean, I will say, in their defense, this person was not they were not the most well off. They were pretty frugal, and even if they had money, you would not have known it. But that was the advice given: was we would grow better as a couple if we lived in poverty, which
I've
was
been pretty poor. Um,
yeah,
I'm going to just gently disagree.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
I did too, as a matter of fact. Also, a congregation where I left eventually got a pay raise of about 10,000. Okay, which was close, by the way, to about a 33% raise when I got it. No, that was yeah, a little bit more than that, 40% raise. And when they went to hire somebody else, they had to spend quite a bit more than what I was making just to get somebody to come move there. And I did, to their credit, a majority of those men apologized to me directly. So I will give that. Some people, let me say this about the financial side of this stuff. Some people just don't know any better, and I think it's getting better. But I remember we've had a show in the past, Phil, where it talked about how the money that you pay a preacher is not the same money that normal people get in a normal job because of self-employed and all the other responsibilities. And that's something most people do not understand. That's just to give them a little bit of an out and some grace. They don't get that.
right. We did a couple of things. We had a CPA come in and talk about a preacher and his taxes, and then Dylan Cornwell, who works in the HR
Yes.
field, sat down with us and with me. I think you were out of town that day, and we kind of walked through an understanding of the wage packages that can be available in a couple different sectors, and compare them to what typically takes place for preachers. I will say this, and here's the balance of things. Um, I've seen some really great perspective on that same area as well. There's a congregation I know of where, when they were trying to readjust their budget, one of the elders said to the sizable group, he says, "All you deacons, I would like for you to quietly put your income, if you know it pre or post tax, on this piece of paper and hand it to another deacon over there. And we're going to use that as an average to kind of give us a guideline for what an evangelist should be reimbursed to, or wages provided for in the area." That's a healthier model. It works for that local church. It may not work for every local church, but it's certainly one that is not going to be overly or unduly influenced by one edge or the other of that conversational space. I think that's important.
There's some ways you can come up with that number. Look, another positive. I had a group where I owned 2 houses when I moved to Memphis, and to the deacon's credit there, they went after a couple months and told the elders, this guy needs more money. He's got 2 house payments. You're not taking care of him. So there's stories out there of people that really get it. And I think that's important too. So, hey, Chris Emerson, good to see you.
Here's another one that kind of is in the same space. I was encouraged and advised to consider opting out of the Social Security tax system. And the rules have changed regarding to the standard for that. It's much stricter now to opt out. But there are unintended consequences with that choice, even if you're disciplined with your finances. That is going to make your financial situation more difficult over the years. There's a generation of preachers that are a few years older than me and a few years younger than me that were encouraged heavily to do that. I don't know if you were too, Terry. You
I
may
was.
have been. And there's consequences to that choice that may not be well understood on how you interact with a lot of your preacher level choices in life.
And again, I will say back then, the idea was Social Security wouldn't be around now, if you remember.
That was one of the statements. And my bad advice box with that is that it's not just about that. It's not even about the question of its existence. It's about learning to get a larger perspective of advice. In this particular case, the advice was given with great intention from a great person with great goals in mind. But I should have done a little more research from my particular situation, and say, okay, this is kind of where I'm going to be. And so I think that was something that's changed. I think for the most part, most young men are not encouraged to do that anymore. And actually the rules to do so are so tight and so stringent, it'd be incredibly difficult to opt out on an individual faith level, because that's what they're asking you to do, is to make a statement of faith.
And when we made those decisions, it didn't take much to do that. It was very lax in comparison to now.
Yeah, the wording was different. They've actually offered 2 separate instances where you could opt back into the system since then. Limited cases. I don't think that's going to happen again, though. I think for going forward, that window of opportunity is closed for that generation to participate back into the program.
They just locked out.
Yeah. Hal talks about this housing issue. I'll add this too, and this is also that space. Generally, this is connected to Hal's little comment there. Generally speaking, preachers' houses benefit the church, not the preacher. Generally speaking.
Terrible idea. And yet when you're starting out, you're advised to do that. But I know guys, Phil, you do too probably, who didn't own a house until they quote unquote retired, didn't own their own property.
Right. The legacy of its culture is that in the time where that took place, most men were moving every 2 to 3 years.
Correct.
So in that context, it did 2 things. It still benefited the church, but it also trapped those men into this habit of moving every couple of years. Um,
A
and
church could pay a guy less if they owned the property.
yeah,
It's just point blank.
right. And the house became an investment for the church, and now they've invested in it once. And Colton points out, even if they had the financial capacity or capability to retire, um,
Well, because again, if they opted out of Social Security, they really can't. Just a little nugget there. It's
uh,
impossible. They have no income if they retire.
it's not just income because they didn't save. They didn't
What's
save that way.
insurance? It's income. It's a whole lot of stuff.
Insurance is a big part of Social Security.
Yeah.
It's not about the dollars that come in,
Yep.
which is a substantial benefit of its own. But be that as it may, that's part of it. Here's a few more. You're thinking about in the actual work of preaching. And I'll ask this to the group, in regards to your sermons, what you should preach, what you shouldn't preach on. Um, Over the years, we've all received various levels of advice of, well, I would never preach on, or I couldn't preach on, or you absolutely should preach on. And for me, I'll say this: there are certain subjects where numbers of folks have said these are subjects you have to preach every single year. They're just timeless things that every year you've got to hit on them. And I will say that for me, I've kind of determined that that's not the right fit for the work that I do. In some contexts, those subjects certainly need regular attention, but I do not believe that making a hallmark of your preaching that these 12 sermons get rehashed 12 times a year creates a healthy, rich understanding of God, of the Bible, of being a disciple. It may get you really good at answering those questions, but it may not build you into a true good student of the Bible.
Yeah, um, I will tell you that it's interesting to think about that because when you say here's a list of things you have to do, you have to preach, it takes out the consideration of the congregation where you're at and their makeup, what they actually need, what their knowledge level is. Sometimes, and I've done that in the past. I followed that advice early on. Sometimes that created more confusion than give answers if you're not careful. So you got to be careful with that.
Yeah, and Chris talks about this. This is something important. As a side note, I'll bring up the quote for everybody to see again. It's kind of long, but yes, you can regain your full vestiture into the Social Security system. You can contact the Social Security office. They will send you a report of your total quarters that you have become vested into. You'll be able to figure out how many more you would need to get into the system to qualify for the healthcare portion of it. Your income potential part of it is going to be diminished because of the number of quarters and how they do that math. But it definitely can be an option. It does require a little bit of careful planning, and you would definitely want to talk to a tax professional in that process and talk to someone directly at the Social Security Administration. And they're actually really good about that. If you go to a local office and talk to one of the local employees about sorting it out, you don't need to go to a faceless, nameless phone bank, even in the current context, to set up an appointment and go talk. I know some Christians who work in those roles in various places across the U.S., and it's part of what they do. It's a great solution to that. So, back on the content of the preaching, and this got to have a certain subject, got to have a certain idea. There's one more piece of advice that I think it needs to kind of be reframed. This is the idea that if you're going to preach, you need to have a backup degree or backup skill plan or a backup job.
Yeah.
I've always felt like that's bad advice. And this is part of the why. It's basically says, I'm going to get out of this at some point.
You're going to fail. You're going to fail. That's what it says.
And so my perspective is, instead, you should be seeking to be well trained to do the thing that you love. Now, that training can come from an internship opportunity system where you get quality mentorship and you focus on your skills in that context. It can come from academic training where you pursue a series of advancing degrees, or some combination of those two things. Preacher prenup. Um,
Look,
I'll talk about. I know exactly what Bob's talking about. I think, and he's not talking about marriage. But
by the way, this is a personal one for me because I had family members who told me that I would never survive as a full-time preacher because I didn't have a plan to back up. And that was tied to the fact that I quit going to college, okay, and started preaching. And since I didn't have a 4-year degree, I was destined to be a failure, and I needed a backup plan, and I ignored that. Which, by the way, for those who don't know me, I could have gone and welded full time and made good money as a welder because I had done that while I was in college. That could have been a viable backup plan. But this person involved had a doctor level degree, and
were
if
you
you
a Wimpy's welding employee?
no, actually, I was somewhere else that we actually did some work with Wimpy's at times. Um, but the fact the company I was with doesn't exist anymore. They folded finally because he retired and nobody wanted to take it over. And I went to visit the guy, and he said, if you come back to work, you would be owning the company right now, which is true because it's the only guy there that probably could have done that. I'm just saying there were things I could do, but I was told I was going to be a failure. Which, by the way, Phil, my personality just fueled me
That
in a
just forced
way.
you. That just forced you to not get a degree.
It's like, yeah, I'm gonna show you
that was
failure.
Like guaranteed.
Yeah. That was the worst thing you could do. But we don't. I was gonna get this. We don't do this with anything else. Like, my kids, my son has decided now he's gonna go back to school, which is good to be a nurse. He's doing construction now. I'm not telling him, hey, dude, you need to get a backup plan in case nursing doesn't work out. Like, nobody does that. My wife is a teacher. By the way, she doesn't really enjoy the classroom anymore for a lot of reasons. But she still teaches. You know why? She didn't have a backup plan to teaching. Why don't we tell teachers to go get a different degree in case teaching doesn't work out? We don't do that with anybody else. Why do we do that with this?
I'll say that partly because
we know how we treat preachers. That's why.
We know that it's a toxic environment in some cases.
Yeah. When you treat people like property, you're afraid they're going to quit and want to do something else. That's the problem.
And Bob talks about the preacher prenup concept, and I'll put that back up there again just for a second, but we'll back off. So this is what I'm kind of angling there. There's a part of me and a part of brethren in general who kind of go on the idea that a commitment and a handshake is enough for a lot of things. And it really is on the quality of a person's character. And if you've got good people involved, it absolutely is enough. But here's the thing. One day, you or someone else will either forget or move and no longer be the person backing up the authentic nature of those conversations. So I will suggest that while you don't need a contract, although you might, you need to get stuff down in writing. Have a written agreement that says this is what we agreed to, so that when you forget, and you will, and you, the preacher, will forget things, you can go back and say, hey, when we started, this was our agreement, and we agreed that it would look like this. And now we're not doing the agreement. So should we revisit the agreement to change it? Or should we go back to the agreement?
What if the eldership changes? In this work and the one before, the eldership changed, and that brought some changes to our agreement because the new elders didn't like some of the agreements. Now, they didn't realize that was part of our agreement, right? You have to think long term there, that when the guys that you're working with change, it may change the nature of your work. And if you don't have anything that's a recording of what you agreed to, it's really hard to go in and go, wait a minute, this is what I agreed to, and you're changing that. So there needs to be at least an understanding of the arrangement. And I wish we could. It sounds bad, Phil, to say that you can't just trust the honor system. Like, that sounds really bad when we're talking about preachers and churches. And it's not so much that. It's just you forget people change. There's a lot. This is a living, breathing organism. It's going to change. You have to be prepared for the changes that can come.
And look, contract renewals are totally normal in the part of everyone else's part of their lives. Like I guarantee you, if everyone's bought a phone, updated their computer, they've re-upped their contractual arrangement with that company on a quarterly basis in some cases. So it's not a big thing. We make it a big thing because if like, oh, we failed the first time to get this right, so now we're having to fix it. No, you're just adjusting because things have changed,
Right.
and it's okay. Chris talks about the idea or the advice that some will have that you have to have your own job on, support yourself so you can preach for free. And I'm going to set aside one component. I know a number of guys who absolutely love what we would consider bivocational work in that sense, where they love doing their job A and offering their labor to a congregation in some other capacity as part B. But I do think there's a subset of brethren and preachers who have taken the incidental behavior of Paul, where he made tents for a time until he didn't need to, and have come away with the idea that this is the best and only way to accomplish the work. And I would say that's not biblical. It's counter the actual teaching of Paul. It's counter the illustration of the entire spiritual arrangement of the Old Testament. And it's actually just a placebo that makes both parties feel better when it's not better. Like, it's just like, oh, yeah, our preacher's also, a welder. Since we mentioned being a welder already, I can use that as an illustration.
We take this exception to the practice and make it the rule here sometimes. It's a weird thing. Now, look, I will tell you, there's times, my son that has done some preaching that plans on being a nurse, I've told him, I said, hey, there's a lot of freedom with nursing. You could work 3 days a week and still preach somewhere if you wanted to. That would be a great life. And there is some merit, Phil, you understand this, because of the behavior of brethren, the way things work out sometimes. Being bivocational, where you were dependent completely on one congregation for your salary, it's not something that I would totally frown upon at times.
Right.
Just to be
and I'll
honest.
add this. When Terry says behavior, brethren, he's including he and I in that statement. Like, our own
Absolutely.
preacher level behavior doesn't always serve the good of the preacher or the church. And let me add this to Hal's
all
comments.
of us, the behavior of all of us is an issue there.
The tie-in of Chris and Hal's comments together. Two things I think should really happen. This I've agreed to work with the church congregate concept needs to be coupled with our family is placing membership with the church. I think those should be separate things that represent two parts of the forming of a relationship. And then also to tie it together, one more thing that kind of sorts all this through with Chris's comment, also Bob's. These perspectives have to have a out perspective as well. When the church or when the preacher determines that it's in the best interest of us, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you that this is happening. It won't be a surprise. We're going to work through it together. It's a healthier outcome when that takes place. Because otherwise you end up what's happening very often right now is men who were preaching full time, who are now doing other things because they were let go last week or let go 2 months ago, and there was no warning, no timing for it.
There needs to be an agreed upon
process.
Process. I'm going to give you this much notice. You're going to give me this much time. And it's funny. I was thinking about this yesterday. There's a job opening at LSU for football. There's some thought that Jimbo Fisher may be robbed away from Texas A&M. And somebody posted on Twitter that I think Jimbo Fisher's buyout's like $90 million. Right? Yeah. It's like if he gets fired without cause, A&M has to pay him $90 million. If he moves, wherever he goes has to pay A&M that $90 million. And I was thinking, man, I need a $90 million buyout clause. Like, I need a...
Yours would be 9 nickels and a taco.
Yeah. But I joke about that. But there does need to be an agreed upon. Hey, if this separation occurs, give me 3 months. Give me
Right.
3 months. I'm just throwing that out there. That used to be. By the way, when we started off, Phil, I think that was the normal. Was 3 months, 90 days. And that 90 days could be that I preach there for those 90 days and you still support me. That can be you hate my guts, but you're still going to give me 90 days of pay and you tell me to go elsewhere. But give me 3 months. Um,
Yeah.
well, and how that's where this is all. That's the prenup. You gotta.
Yeah.
This is what you've got to have discussed. And I will tell you, I went through a bad breakup. I was given an indefinite period of time till I found a place. I was given 6 months. As bad as that breakup was, I will say those guys took care of me and provided for me, and they should be praised for that. And as the behavior said earlier, and I've been very open about this, this was bad behavior on my part, their part, all of our parts that led to that breakdown of that relationship. But the breakup was clean in that sense, even though, quite frankly, there wasn't a lot written down about that. And had there been a lot written down about, we probably wouldn't have as clean a breakup as good. So I do think there's something to be said for that. But it is awkward when you decide to leave. It is awkward when you're asked to leave. All of it is very awkward. But there needs to be a plan of transition along the way for somehow.
Right. And Chris, I think that the smartest maneuver is to just build a cost of living adjustment into a evangelist wage so that it just is tied to the rise of expenses. And then, as you pointed out, a salary assessment takes place on an annual basis because those are two separate things.
Yeah.
Cost of living doesn't change at the same rate as a person's life setting would change. And I think there's a balance that needs to be kind of maintained by you do those two things together.
I'll float an idea out to all the churches. Our cost of living is just an automatic thing that our two financial deacons are assigned to take care of. There's a date. I'm supposed to have a COLA on that date. And they're given a kind of, hey, look at here. This is how you figure this out. The elders aren't involved in that anymore. They're too busy doing shepherding things to worry about us having to sit down and say, hey, I didn't get a cost of living raise. That's been given to these two deacons. That's their job. It works like clockwork. We don't have any issues. It's never that needs to be discussed. If you're not getting a cost of living agreement raise, you need to be doing that. I would go talk to the elders, say, hey, this is a lot for us to handle all the time. Just hand this off to the deacon who's over that. It's just simple advice.
All right, folks, that's the space for our conversation today. If you've got additional bad advice, don't share it. But if you want to share it with us so we can maybe put it out in a different context, we'd be happy to take that from you. Terry's got one last thing. I'll let him throw that in there. Go ahead, Terry. Go, Terry.
This is the worst piece of advice I've ever given anybody. And I will repent of this publicly. I have discouraged young men from preaching. And I've done that more than once. Truthfully, discouraged my son at one point, and by the time it was time to encourage him, it probably was a little too late. But there's other factors involved with that as well. Hey, this is a very important topic for me, and I think Phil. There are a lot of churches with empty pulpits, and we need to start encouraging our younger men and our smarter men, our smarter guys. We need to encourage them to do competent men
with good character.
We need strong young men of character that are intelligent. Stop telling the guy that makes a 33 on his ACT that he needs to go make money to support the church, and tell him what he ought to do is preach the gospel. That's my thing. I mean, and look, I'm not saying this is for everybody, but if we don't start encouraging our best and brightest to take up the pulpit, the church is going to suffer. The church is going to suffer. And that's the worst advice I ever gave anybody. So there you go. Confession time.
It's fine. While I believe 100% there are some men who should not be preaching, there are some men who should.
Right.
And we need to embolden and encourage the ones who have the skill and the heart to do so. And it's not for every person. There's a balance between encouragement and discouragement that takes place in the natural ebb and flow and the development of a person's abilities and skills. And so we could definitely do better at that. And I don't think we have it. with that, as a side note, there's two more churches who reached out to me in the last couple days that are looking for someone to come work with them. One of them, I'm pretty close to two of the shepherds that help, two of the three shepherds that help lead that group, and it'd be a great place to be. Um, and you know, across the board, this is the challenge of today. Is helping us learn from some of our own mistakes, bad advice we've given as well, um, and also do better in the future. All right, everybody, take care. Have a great day. If we can help in some way, please let us know.